Hello, welcome to the Terminology Leading Practices stream of the SNOMED CT Expo 2021. My name is Nikki Ingram. I'm a senior terminologist at SNOMED International, and I will be moderating today's session. Please use the live Q&A in your AirTouch device to type your questions to the presenter. All questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. I'm now pleased to introduce Rob Hausam from MITRE Corporation, who will be presenting SNOMED CT GPS and the IPS International Patient Summary, a partnership for enhancing global clinical data exchange. Rob, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Nikki, for the introduction. I'm pleased to be able to be here today to talk with all of you about the SNOMED CT GPS and the IPS, the International Patient Summary. So let me move to the first slide. This is just a little bit about me. I am an MD. I work now for the MITRE Corporation. Actually, as of just this week, I've been working for a considerable time as a healthcare informatics consultant. I am a family physician and electrical and computer engineer, and I co-lead the HL7 International Patient Summary project, and have a number of other roles in the standards organizations, including in SNOMED, working on the SNOMED on Fire project. So that's just a little bit about my background. Now let's talk about the IPS and its background, and I'll give you an overview of that. So IPS began with an agreement between HL7 International and SEN TC251 in April 2017, where we expressed a vision in order to further the care for citizens across the globe. We agreed to collaborate on a single common international patient summary, IPS specification that is readily usable by all clinicians for the cross-border unscheduled care of a patient. That was the beginning. And the scope that we outlined at that time was that the IPS specification shall focus on a minimal and non-exhaustive patient summary, which is specialty agnostic and condition independent, but still clinically relevant. So with that in mind, the IPS principles that we have worked on are that the international patient summary should be implementable, it should be applicable for global use, should be extensible and open, and it should be sustainable. And so with that, basically what the IPS is it's a health record extract. It's a snapshot in time of a subject of care's health information and healthcare status. As it says in the name, it is international. It's intended to provide generic solutions for global application, and that goes beyond any particular region or country. And its scope is, as I said earlier, is that it's designed initially, at least, for unscheduled cross-border care. But from the very beginning, we have intended for it to be also be broader than that, to provide a baseline that is usable also with other types of scheduled or planned care cases. And so the IPS is a focused patient summary. And by summary, I should say that summary means that we don't include all of the data on a patient. This is not the entire electronic health record. It's a focused summary of relevant clinical data, and it's intended to provide a healthcare summary for a citizen at the point of care, to basically to provide the most useful information that would be needed for any subsequent care situation that a patient may find themselves in. Okay. The patient summary itself is, like I said, it's not the entire electronic health record. It's minimal and it's not exhaustive. But with that, it is still, it's specialty agnostic and it's condition independent, but with that, it's still clinically relevant. That's the idea, is to have the most clinically relevant data that's needed for whatever care situation the patient will find themselves in. If they're traveling cross borders or finding themselves outside of their normal care situation, that's where the patient summary can be used. So the IPS is designed to be simple and implementable, and to be usable at any time, in any place, and by anyone. And that there should be multiple beneficiaries, both individuals, healthcare providers, and society as a whole. Now, those are pretty lofty goals, as you can see, but the intent is to keep those in mind as we have developed the specification in order to be able to provide something that's useful for citizens wherever they find themselves. So this slide shows a little bit about what's in the IPS, about the sections that we have, and what kinds of data is included. And so on the left-hand side, there's some sections about metadata, which include just basic information such as the subject and the author of the document and anyone who attests to it and anyone who's responsible for that. If you're familiar with the HL7 CDA specification, that's like the CDA header. And then there's a set of required, recommended, and optional sections. The required sections include medications, allergies and intolerances, and a problem list. Those are felt to be critical pieces of information that really are essential for any type of care scenario. And so those are required sections, and basically you either have the document has data for those sections, or if there is no data, then there's an explicit statement of that fact. So there's never ambiguity about that. But beyond the required sections, then there are the recommended and optional sections. So we have other sections that we think are likely to be very useful in the recommended category, including domains such as immunizations. And those are maybe considered particularly interesting in our present times, dealing with the COVID pandemic and other situations we find themselves in. Immunization data may be extremely important, but it is in a recommended and not required section. There's also information about procedures and medical devices that the patient may have implanted or be using otherwise, and also important diagnostic results. Then the optional sections are other items that may be deemed to be particularly useful in a care setting, and they may or may not be present, and you can see those on the slide. Okay. So the IPS is organized as a document composed by a set of reusable profiles. And again, it's those sections that we just showed, the medications, allergies, problems, immunizations, results, and so forth. And you see those there. And then they lead into the IPS library of profiles. And so if the IPS is intended for more specialized uses, not as an entire document, then those profiles can be used for other specialized purposes. An example of that would be of the use of the library would be, as I mentioned, vaccination data may be very important, particularly in the times we are in right now. And so we might, we add some extensions dealing specific characteristics of the vaccinations and multiple vaccinations that have been received, and then that data could be used to create the WHO yellow card or its equivalent. And now we're in the era of digital vaccine certificates, and we envision the IPS being used in this type of scenario. There's some active projects that are working on basing smart vaccination cards on IPS data and having those be conformant, compatible with each other. So that's an exciting area that we're looking at right now. Okay. And this slide is a bit busy, but it gives an idea of the general landscape that we're dealing with in the standards world around the IPS. And up at the top is the guidelines that have been developed, particularly in the European Union around patient summaries that was used as input, and the original standards from SEN, which now have been globalized in ISO as the ISO 27269 standard, which informs the data set for the IPS. And then you see the relationships with the other the other specifications, including the HL7 IPS Fire implementation guide and also a companion CDA implementation guide that we have. And IHE, as a standards organization, takes those and includes them into their IHE IPS profile. And then you can see at the bottom, SNOMED and the IPS free set is being used by these specifications. So that's how all these things fit together, and we'll talk in some more detail about how those fit together here in a moment. So this gives a very nice picture of what this kind of what this is all about in terms of building up the IPS from its individual parts. We have the IPS as a whole in the billboard, and SNOMED you see there, and the various specifications, including the implementation guides, HL7 Fire and CDA, and the various standards and guidelines that those are built on. So this is a nice graphic to show kind of how this all works together. And I have one more those to look at, which again shows a bit more of the flow of the standards, artifacts, and processes as we're developing this, as we're working together to further develop and implement these specifications. We start with the specifications, the data set standards from SEN and ISO, and then we implement those in the HL7 and IHE implementation guides and profiles. And the terminology is driven and feeds into all of that, and there's a feedback loop to this. We'll be talking about here in a moment about how those feed together and work to further enhance and improve the standards. And then we carry that on into various activities involved in implementation and testing of conformance to the standard as we're working on implementations, and that would be in the HL7 Fire and the IHE Connectathons, where we do that detailed testing. Okay, so that's the overview of what the IPS is, and now we'll talk more about terminology and how it's used in IPS and some of the details and characteristics of that. So the characteristics that we believe are desirable for terminology in IPS are, of course, that it needs to be available, it needs to be suitable, that it's fit for its purpose, it should be acceptable for use globally. And the idea would be that it would be developed with the intent of global use and also with significant global participation in its development, maintenance, and quality assurance. And a key principle that we use is to make the IPS value sets available for global use at no cost for implementation of the IPS. So that's a bit of a high bar. And now we'll talk a little bit about how that fits with SNOMED CT and its use in IPS. And so given those principles that we just looked at, why would we choose SNOMED CT for IPS? I think most of the people in this audience would probably be able to appreciate this very readily. But SNOMED CT is generally considered to be the premier global clinical terminology. So it's an obvious choice for use in multiple sections and profiles in the IPS. It has the broadest clinical domain coverage that would be relevant to the IPS. There's a robust global community behind its development, implementation, and use. And therefore, it seems to be really a nearly ideal choice for use in most, if not all, of the clinical data elements of the IPS. But there are some limitations of that for using SNOMED CT in the IPS. And the key principle that I mentioned about making the IPS value sets available for global use at no cost is not, universally possible with SNOMED CT, because SNOMED, as I'm sure you all know, is organized and supported based on a per country membership model. The member countries are assessed a membership fee, and that's based on the current World Bank gross national income values. And then SNOMED CT content is made available for use within that country free of additional charges. So currently we have, if I counted correctly, at least, there are 41 SNOMED member countries, and there's representation of that in the Americas, Europe, Middle East, Africa, and the Asia Pacific Asia Pacific regions. But there are still many other non-member countries. And the intention of the IPS is to be able to serve all of those. So to use SNOMED CT in a non-member country, it needs to be a SNOMED CT affiliate license obtained, and typically there'd be some level of cost involved depending on the particular organization or individual. And so this is a barrier for us being able to recommend the use of SNOMED CT as a general solution in the IPS specifications. So there's naturally a desire to find a solution that allows a broader recommendation for being able to use SNOMED within IPS. And with that enters the SNOMED CT free sets and the GPS, the global patient set. So SNOMED has developed the idea of offering to several organizations, including HL7, an opportunity to select a limited subset of SNOMED concepts to be included in the free set. And those would be available free of charge to anyone for use in that organization's standards. And HL7 initially chose the IPS as its basis for its SNOMED free set selection. And then after a number of organizations had made their selections, ultimately SNOMED International decided to combine all of the free sets into a single freely available global patient set. And that was first published in September 2019 and is updated yearly. Not biannually like the general SNOMED releases have typically been published. But the most recent one was published just a very short time ago and at the end of last month. And that contains a total of 23,613 concepts. So it's growing a bit over time. It started out, but it's a small number compared to the total of SNOMED concepts, but hopefully it's a useful number, and that's what we'll continue to talk about here. So the rationale for the GPS is basically to be able to use structured clinical data without barriers and support preferred conditions for interoperability. And for some users, the GPS may provide a starting point for migration to the use of more full use of SNOMED CT and eventually membership in SNOMED International. And so the GPS allows for a managed exposure and use of SNOMED CT without requiring initial investment. And that makes it perfect for our needs in IPS. And so with the remaining slides, we'll be talking about the idea of the partnership that we have between the two standards and the two basically the two projects and organizations. So we believe that the GPS should be very useful for implementers of the IPS standard that are based in countries that are currently not SNOMED CT members. The GPS can serve as a starting point for those IPS implementations. And it does provide a real, even if somewhat limited, value. And as already mentioned, it's an opportunity potentially for organizations and individuals in these countries to gain some experience and familiarity with both, not only with the IPS standards, but also with SNOMED CT itself. And so our expectation is that both the IPS and SNOMED communities will start with this and will continue to work towards solutions that work even better and are more comprehensive, in the future, ideally based on the GPS. And so where we've incorporated GPS into the IPS standards so far, and we've used it as a basis for a number of IPS value sets. Those include substances that cause allergy or intolerance, allergic reactions, problem list items, laboratory and radiology results, extensively in microorganisms for infectious disease, and also specimen types and collection methods. Importantly, also in vaccine and vaccine target diseases, and some in procedures. But there are some notable IPS value sets presently that do not have any GPS concepts. They have other SNOMED value sets, but not content is not in the GPS, and those include medications. That's been a very difficult area for us to find really what are the best solutions for that. But the GPS doesn't offer us much in that area, at least not at present. Medication route of administration, also we use a different terminology for that at this point, and medical devices is another one. But most of the clinical value sets do have GPS content, and with that we hope to be able to expand and improve on that as we go forward. So in our future plans and partnership, excuse me, SNOMED International has offered to continue to enhance the content of both the IPS free set and then the overall GPS based on the experience that we gain in IPS implementations. And that experience that we gain will help identify and can help measure the gaps in the current GPS content. And this can be used to further enhance the GPS offering. So the intention is over time to expand the coverage of the GPS in supporting the exchange of IPS data for clinical care, both in the cross-border and in other specialized situations like the vaccination certificates that I mentioned. And so this experience is expected to provide an incentive for additional countries, as already mentioned, to become SNOMED CT members. And so with all of that, we believe, conclusions are that we believe that this is a partnership and collaboration between the IPS project and the IPS specification, and with SNOMED International and the GPS, that's a useful partnership and collaboration. And as we do gain additional experience with our IPS implementations, we expect that this partnership is likely to become even more useful over time. And we expect that each specification will be able to contribute to the content and use of the other. So a very nice synergy and partnership. And so with that, we look very much forward to the continuing development and working together of both the IPS and the SNOMED CT and GPS standards. So thank you very much. At this point, we can take questions, and if you wish to contact me further, you have the email addresses there, and I'd be happy to answer further questions at any time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob, for your presentation. Can I ask that attendees give us a moment while we switch over from our pre-recorded content so that they can address the questions you've been submitting live? Please note that this session will be available on the event platform for the next 3 months. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
Hello, we're here for our live Q&A session. If you'd like to type your question in the AirTouch button under the Q&A tab. I do have a couple of questions, Rob.
Okay.
The first one that's coming, if other terminologies besides SNOMED CT are used to create an IPS document, can you also include SNOMED CT codes?
Okay, that's a good question. And the answer to that is yes, you can. Both the HL7 fire standard in particular, which is where we're probably putting most of our efforts into these days. We have the CDA standard as well, but actually both of the standards allow for multiple codes and codings to be used for any particular clinical data element. So I guess for an example, if someone was sending a code in ICD-10 for diagnosis, because that was, what their system is based on or what is required, typically for them to send. They could also, in addition, send the appropriate SNOMED CT code along with that. And of course, we would recommend that they do that wherever that's possible. So, so we both allow and encourage the use of multiple codings and using, sending the SNOMED code whenever it's available and possible to do that.
Thank you. That's very interesting. You can do that. I have another question that's come in. Does the GPS have sufficient concept coverage in the domains where it is recommended as a choice for use in IPS?
Yeah.
Does it have sufficient coverage, basically?
Right. That's a question that I guess we have some thoughts about, but we're still in the process of trying to actually answer based on the real world use that we're starting to see with implementation efforts that are going on in various quarters. So as I mentioned in the slide, I think there's in the current release of the GPS for 2021. There are about 23,000, a little bit more SNOMED CT concepts in. That is, less than a tenth of the total number of concepts. It's actually, yeah, anyway, but it's less than a tenth, and it's unclear, exactly how well represented the needed concepts are, to actually have an effective implementation. So it's part of the experiment, really, that we want to engage in with our implementers. The idea is basically to start with the GPS and use it where it's where that makes sense, and then find out what the gaps are and that probably do exist. And so that's part of the feedback loop that I was mentioning. Once we gain some experience, then we can find where we have areas that we do need additional content, and then we can gather that information, and then we can bring that back to SNOMED International and use that as a basis for future requests for GPS content. So we can continue, as I said, to kind of progress the standards in both areas, both in the terminology and how we use it in the data models. So we expect that the end, in summarizing, expect that it's really not adequate at this point, but we do expect it to become more adequate over time, and we encourage people to use it and then to give us the feedback that we need so we can make it better and make it more usable.
So you're actively seeking user feedback to,
yes.
And that's how you're planning to enhance the content?
Yes, basically, I think pretty much the agreement is that, we can make additional requests, like I said, and SNOMED International will consider those, and in most cases probably would accept those, but they need to be based on, real world needs, not just, something we think we might need, find out that we actually do need. And then with that, we can bring that forward and we can improve the content coverage.
I have a final question about does the GPS include vaccine codes that will support the creation of digital vaccine certificates? I don't know. Are you able to answer that, Rob?
Yeah, I think I can answer that. And I would say that the coverage of that in the GPS right now is pretty limited.
Okay.
Looking through the latest release again, there's a handful of vaccine codes, but they're at a fairly high level. Looking particularly at the vaccines for COVID that we're all interested in these days very much. The GPS contains only a single code for COVID-19 vaccines. So where it lacks is it doesn't have any of the specificity for the various vaccines that we know are available around the world. So, Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca and Sinovac and Sputnik and all the ones that we know, but we don't have available specific codes to indicate those. And we know also that's going to be important information to have in a subsequent care scenario. So just saying that someone had a COVID vaccination is almost certainly, for most purposes, not sufficient. So that's an area, again, where I think the coverage undoubtedly is too limited at this point. But if we start using IPS and IPS based profiles for communicating vaccination data for COVID and for other diseases, then we can begin to make the case for including additional codes into the GPS. And again, I believe SNOMED International will at least seriously consider that. Of course, they have a plan, which I don't know all the details of myself at this point, for how they plan to progress the coverage of vaccinations in general in SNOMED, but we believe that some of that will be able to be incorporated into the GPS.
Thanks, Rob. We're almost out of time. So if anyone has any more questions, please go to the meeting hub to ask them. And thanks very much.
All right. Thank you, Nikki. Okay.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you everyone for joining.